Here is the uncomfortable truth that most men never hear, let alone understand. A woman does not lose interest because you suddenly became less attractive. Sometimes she loses interest because she became too certain that you will always be there. And that changes everything. Because attraction is not simply about how much attention you give someone. It is also about uncertainty, scarcity, emotional investment, and the perceived possibility of loss. Niccolo Machiavelli understood a principle centuries ago that still appears in human behavior today. People value what they believe they could lose. And if you understand that principle, you begin to understand why some men are constantly being chased while others are constantly chasing. Not because one man is necessarily richer, not because he is better looking, not because he has some magical secret. He simply understands something most men never learn. Access creates value only when access is not guaranteed. Think about a door. If a door is permanently open, you stop thinking about it. You walk through it without hesitation. But if that same door can close, suddenly you pay attention. You notice when it is open. You notice when it is closed. And most importantly, you notice whether you still have the key. That is the psychological mechanism we are going to examine today. Not manipulation, not tricks, not controlling another human being, but the vulnerabilities, blind spots, and emotional patterns that influence attraction and how your behavior either strengthens or destroys your position inside that dynamic. Because most men make the same mistake. They think attraction is something they create by giving more. More messages, more attention, more explanations, more reassurance, more availability. But there is a point where more stops creating attraction and starts creating certainty. And certainty can completely change the emotional dynamic. Machiavelli did not write for men who wanted everyone to like them. He wrote about power, about incentives, about human nature, about what people do when appearances disappear and self-interest takes over. And if he were alive today, he would not tell you to become cruel. He would tell you to understand the game you are already playing, because every relationship contains a psychological negotiation. Who invests first? Who becomes more emotionally dependent? Who chases? Who pulls away? Who fears losing the other person, and who quietly knows I will be fine either way? That is where real leverage begins. Today, we are going through 11 female vulnerabilities that repeatedly appear in attraction. 11 psychological blind spots that can influence who invests, who chases, who becomes attached, and who starts taking the other person for granted. And here is where most men get it wrong. They hear the word vulnerability and immediately think manipulation. That is not what this is about. The goal is not to exploit someone's weakness. The goal is to understand the psychological mechanism so you stop destroying your own position through neediness, over-pursuit, and constant validation. Because while one man is desperately trying to convince a woman to want him, another man simply refuses to abandon himself just to keep her. That is a completely different psychology. There is another reason you need to stay until the end. One of these vulnerabilities can dramatically change how someone responds to you when your behavior changes consistently over time. Not because you have learned how to control her, but because you finally stopped feeding the pattern that was making you predictable. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth most men do not want to hear. You do not necessarily lose women because you do not have enough money. You do not necessarily lose them because you are not charming enough. And you do not always lose them because another man is better. Sometimes you lose attraction because you became completely predictable. You are always available. You answer instantly. You explain everything. You tolerate everything. You keep proving your interest long after it is already obvious. Eventually, you stop being a possibility. You become a certainty, and psychologically, those are two very different things. Think about your phone. If it never stops buzzing, you eventually stop checking it. But if one particular notification appears unexpectedly, your attention changes. You wonder who it is, why they messaged, what they want. The brain notices what interrupts the pattern. That is why mystery matters. That is why scarcity matters. That is why emotional independence matters. Not because you should play games, but because a person who has their own direction, boundaries, and standards creates a completely different psychological experience from someone who is constantly waiting for approval. Machiavelli understood the principle in another language. The person who controls access controls the value of access. And most men do the exact opposite. They give unlimited access, unlimited attention, unlimited reassurance, unlimited chances. Then they wonder why the other person stops appreciating it. But attraction does not grow simply because you give more. Sometimes it grows when you stop giving what was never being valued. That does not mean disappearing. It does not mean pretending not to care. It does not mean ignoring someone to make them anxious. It means something much simpler. You stop negotiating against yourself. You respond without begging. You communicate without over-explaining. You show interest without surrendering your entire identity. And you become comfortable with the possibility that someone might walk away. Because the man who genuinely believes I would rather lose her than lose myself moves differently. He does not need to threaten. He does not need to manipulate. He does not need to chase. His boundaries speak for him. His absence has meaning because his presence has value. The first vulnerability is probably the one you have seen 100 times without realizing what you were looking at. The need for validation. You hear it in harmless questions. Did you like it? How do I look? Are you mad at me? Why are you acting different? They sound innocent. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they are really asking something deeper. Do I still have your attention? And this is where most men expose themselves. She asks for reassurance, and they immediately jump in. You look amazing. No, I am not mad. Of course, everything is fine. Instant reassurance, instant approval. I used to think that was just being a good man. But think about what happens when you give someone reassurance every single time they ask for it. Eventually, it stops feeling special. It becomes expected. Imagine you are sitting with her and she tells you about something she accomplished. Most men immediately go overboard. That is incredible. You are amazing. I am so proud of you. She smiles. But what exactly did your words cost you? Nothing. And that is the problem. Real validation has weight because it is not automatic. A sincere compliment given because you genuinely mean it can hit harder than 50 compliments thrown around just to keep someone happy. And here is the part that hurts. A lot of men do not validate women because they want to make them feel good. They do it because they are afraid. Afraid she will lose interest. Afraid she will pull away. Afraid that if they stop feeding the connection, she will stop choosing them. So they keep giving. And the more they give, the more they need her reaction to feel secure. That is the trap. Selective validation is not cruelty. It is emotional discipline. You do not need to approve everything. You do not need to react to everything. And you certainly do not need to prove your interest every 5 minutes, because the moment your approval becomes automatic, it loses its power. Now let us move to the second vulnerability, uncertainty. The human mind hates an unfinished story. You send a message and she does not answer. You see her online. 30 minutes pass, then an hour, and suddenly you are not thinking about your work anymore. You are thinking about her. What happened? Did I say something? Is she losing interest? That is how powerful uncertainty can be, not because silence is some magical trick, but because the brain wants closure. And when you do not have the answer, your mind starts writing the story for you. That is why predictability can quietly kill tension. Imagine you text her every night at exactly the same time. Same good morning, same questions, same replies, same emotional availability. You think you are showing consistency, but eventually she does not wonder about you anymore. She already knows. And once someone can predict your every move, there is nothing left to discover. Now, I am not telling you to disappear for 3 days just to make someone anxious. That is not confidence. That is insecurity wearing a costume. Real uncertainty comes from having a life that does not revolve around another person's attention. You reply when you are free. You make plans without giving a minute-by-minute report. You do not panic when there is silence. You do not feel compelled to fill every empty space. And those empty spaces matter because when you stop explaining everything, the other person's mind starts doing the work. But here is the part most men completely miss. If there is nothing behind the silence, uncertainty becomes emptiness. A man with no purpose cannot create mystery. He can only create confusion. So build a life worth disappearing into. Not to manipulate her, but because you actually have somewhere to be. The third vulnerability is emotional understanding. Most men think listening means staying quiet while she talks. It does not. Anyone can hear words. Very few men can hear what sits underneath them. She tells you she is angry, but underneath the anger, She is hurt. She says she does not care, but her tone tells you she cares deeply. When you can recognize that without rushing to fix it, something changes. Her shoulders relax, her voice slows down. She stops defending herself. For a moment, she feels he actually gets me, and that is powerful. But this is where men make another mistake. She opens up, and suddenly they become addicted to the connection. They text more. They become constantly available. They start treating vulnerability as proof that they have already won. That is when connection turns into attachment. And attachment without self-control becomes neediness. The fourth vulnerability is emotional reactivity. One day she is warm. She is texting you. She is laughing. She is fully present. Then almost overnight she becomes distant. Short replies, less enthusiasm, a different tone. No explanation. And this tiny shift can expose a man's entire psychology. The insecure man feels it immediately. His stomach tightens. He checks his phone. Did I do something? What changed? Should I say something? And before he even realizes it, her mood is controlling his mood. That is the trap. The emotionally grounded man notices the change, too. He is not numb. He cares. But he does not hand his nervous system over to someone else's behavior. He keeps his plans, keeps his rhythm, keeps his standards. He does not punish her with silence. He does not suddenly become cold to prove a point. He simply refuses to become a different man because someone else's energy changed. And when she comes back, she finds the same man she left. That detail matters more than most men realize because it communicates something without saying a word. You can influence my emotions, but you do not control me. That is emotional stability, not indifference, not pretending you do not care. It is being able to feel something deeply without immediately acting on it. The fifth vulnerability appears during conflict. I have seen men lose an entire relationship in 10 minutes because they could not tolerate 10 seconds of silence. They raise their voice. She raises hers. He starts explaining. She interrupts. He explains more. And suddenly, they are no longer solving anything. They are fighting to win the moment. That is where a man's frame either holds or collapses. Supporting someone does not mean matching their emotional intensity. Sometimes the strongest response is slower, quieter, shorter. I understand you are upset, but I am not going to have this conversation while we are attacking each other. Then you stop. No speech, no threats, no 20-minute defense of your character. Just a boundary and the willingness to hold it. Because calmness is not weakness. It is what happens when you do not need the other person to validate your position before you can stand on it. The sixth vulnerability is status. I am not talking about money, not designer clothes, not a title you put in your bio. I am talking about presence. The way you walk into a room without needing everyone to notice. The way you speak without rushing. The way you handle being challenged without becoming defensive. People feel that. Watch what happens when someone interrupts you. The insecure man either laughs it off because he needs to be liked or explodes because he needs to prove he is not weak. Both reactions reveal the same thing. He is being controlled by the room. A grounded man does not need either. He looks at the person, pauses, then says calmly, "Let me finish." That is it. No speech, no aggression, no apology for taking up space. That kind of status lives in tiny details. Your posture, your eye contact, your voice, the amount of words you use when 3 would do. The ability to say no without writing an essay explaining why. The seventh vulnerability is consistency. When the relationship becomes comfortable, the performance stops. She is no longer trying to impress you. You are no longer trying to impress her. And that is when people reveal who they actually are. She may say, "Honesty matters to me," then change her story when it is convenient. "I hate being ignored," then disappear for hours without explanation. "I do not play games," then create confusion and expect you to tolerate it. And here is where most men make the fatal mistake. They notice it, but stay quiet. They tell themselves, "It is not worth the argument." Maybe it is not. But silence has a price. Every time you accept something that violates your stated standards, you are teaching the other person what your standards are actually worth. Not what you say they are, what you are willing to tolerate. The eighth vulnerability is direction. I am not talking about having your entire life figured out. I am talking about knowing what you are moving toward. Because I have watched men slowly turn themselves into passengers in their own lives. They ask for permission before making decisions. They change their opinions depending on who they are talking to. They hesitate, overthink, then look to someone else to tell them what they should want. And eventually the relationship feels backwards. Instead of walking beside the man, she feels like she is carrying him. That is exhausting. Real direction is quieter. You listen. You consider. Then you decide. You do not need everyone to agree. You do not need to announce every move. You simply move. The ninth vulnerability is the difference between being available and being valuable. Most men confuse the two. They think security means always answering, always being there, always adjusting, always saying yes. But here is the uncomfortable part. When someone knows they can access you at any moment, your presence can slowly become background noise. Not because they are evil, because certainty changes behavior. Think about it. If you cancel your plans every time she calls, eventually you are not demonstrating devotion. You are demonstrating that your life can be rearranged on demand. Real security comes from choice. She knows you are there because you want to be there, not because you are terrified of losing her. That is a completely different energy. The 10th vulnerability is boundaries, because attraction, respect, direction, and investment mean very little if your boundaries collapse the moment they are tested. It usually does not happen dramatically. It is a joke that goes too far, a disrespectful comment, a repeated inconsistency, a small manipulation disguised as humor, and you are standing there thinking, should I say something? That hesitation is the battlefield, because what you do next tells her whether your standards are real or just words you use when everything is easy. The final mistake most men make is believing that keeping the peace is the same thing as keeping the relationship. It is not. Sometimes keeping the peace means abandoning yourself, and once you do that often enough, you do not just lose respect, you lose the man you were trying to become. The 11th vulnerability is integrity. Because when nobody is watching, who you are is finally revealed. How do you handle rejection, frustration, loneliness? Do you keep your standards when breaking them would be easier? That is where the real man is revealed. A man can talk about discipline while being ruled by anxiety. He can preach self-respect while begging for attention. He can talk about boundaries, then abandon every one of them the moment he is afraid of losing someone. Integrity is different. Your actions match your identity. You do not betray yourself just to avoid being alone. And when a woman feels that consistency, something changes. She may not be able to explain it. She simply senses that you are solid. Not perfect, solid. And that is what holds everything together. Because attraction fluctuates, emotions change, but respect gives the relationship something to stand on. Do not make the mistake of turning these 11 vulnerabilities into another performance. You do not need to become colder. You do not need to memorize tactics. Choose one weakness in yourself that you already recognize and fix it. If you chase, reclaim your rhythm. If you need validation, learn to stand without it. If you tolerate disrespect, enforce one boundary calmly. Because standards are not meant to make women afraid of losing you. They are meant to make you stop losing yourself. And when a man stops abandoning himself, he stops begging to be chosen.